Welcome back, my sweets. We are on chapter 9. Oh, wait, did I skip a chapter? No, there is no chapter 8 in this book, this crazy book. Chapter 9 is something different about Mrs. Jewls. Look at the little hearts. I wonder what that means. The children returned from Christmas vacation. On each desk there were 2 knitting needles and a hunk of yarn. Today we are going to learn how to knit, said Mrs. Jewls. She showed the class how it was done. See, you stick this needle through here, then wrap this around like this, stick this through this, pull this like this, and then you stick this in here. Any questions? Everyone stared at her. Good, said Mrs. Jewls. I want everybody to make socks today. Okay, get started. Damien looked at his knitting needles. He didn't have a clue. He looked back at Mrs. Jewls. Now, more than ever, he was sure she was different somehow. She was sitting at her desk, knitting and eating bolognios. Damien couldn't remember Mrs. Jewls ever eating a bologno before. A bologno was an Oreo cookie, except instead of the white part, there was a round hunk of bologna. Miss Mush invented them. Ugh. Hey, Mac, whispered Damien. Does Mrs. Jewls seem different to you? Yeah, she's fat, said Mac. That is not a nice thing to say, said Damien. I didn't say it to Mrs. Jewls, said Mac. I didn't go, hey, Mrs. Jewls, you're fat. Mrs. Jewls cleared her throat as she stood up. She walked around the room. Very nice, DJ, she said. Oh, you're doing a fine job, Rondi. She stopped at Joe's desk. Oh, Joe, she gussed. Look, everybody. I want you to see Joe's sock. She held it up. Isn't it the most beautiful sock you've ever seen? It was a great sock. Everybody oohed and awed. Joe was as surprised as anyone. He didn't know he knew how to make socks. But the boy was born to knit. Mrs. Jewls started to cry. I love this sock, she sobbed. Uh-oh, said Kathy. I think she's finally flipped out. Oh, I love you, Kathy, said Mrs. Jewls. She looked around the room. I love all of you. She put her hand on Kathy's desk. I love this desk, she said. I love the blackboard. I love that clock on the wall. There was a ruler on the floor. Mrs. Jewls picked it up. I love this ruler, she declared. Hey, that's mine, said Dana. But that's okay, Mrs. Jewls. You can have it. I don't want your ruler, Dana, said Mrs. Jewls, handing it back to her. You want my pair of scissors? Offered Sherry. Don't give her anything sharp, said Kathy. Mrs. Jewls wiped away her tears and smiled at the class. I'm going to miss all of you very much, she said. Are you going away? Asked Damien. Yeah, she's going to the loony bin, whispered Kathy. Are you sick? Asked Eric Ovens. No, I'm not sick, said Mrs. Jewls. In fact, I'm better than I've ever been. She beamed. I'm going to have a baby. Everyone gasped. Damien couldn't believe it. He was so happy that he jumped out of his seat and hugged Mrs. Jewls. Soon she was surrounded by all her students, even Kathy, wanting to hug her. Today is my last day here, Mrs. Jewls told her students. My doctor doesn't want me walking up and down 30 flights of stairs every day. I wasn't even supposed to come today, but I just had to say goodbye. I thought you were getting fat, said Mac, but I didn't want to say anything. Thank you, Mac, said Mrs. Jewls. You are very considerate. Can I touch your stomach? Asked Stephen. Mrs. Jewls laughed. Sure, she said. The children took turns touching her stomach. What are you going to name your baby? Asked Allison. I don't know yet, said Mrs. Jewls. What do you all think? Well, if she's a girl, said Allison, I think you should name her Rainbow Sunshine. Oh, what a nice name, said Mrs. Jewls. And what if he's a boy? Buckethead, said Allison. She didn't like boys. If he's a boy, you should name him Jet Rocket, said Joe. Jet Rocket Jewls, mused Mrs. Jewls. That has a nice ring to it. And what if she's a girl? Cootie face, said Joe. Mrs. Jewls laughed. So let me get this straight, she said. If he's a boy, I'll name him Buckethead. Right, said Allison and Rondi. And if she's a girl, I'll name her Cootie Face. Right, said Joe and John. Damien just laughed. He knew Mrs. Jewls was only joking. At least he hoped she was. Terence placed his palm flat against Mrs. Jewls' stomach. Hey, he exclaimed. The dude just kicked me. Suddenly, Damien felt very sad. He was going to miss her a lot. He wiped a tear from his eye. It's unfair, he shouted. We finally come back to Wayside School after being gone for so long, and now you're leaving us? Damien, I have to, said Mrs. Jewls. I know, whispered Damien. You have to make sure that you and your baby are healthy. But it still isn't fair. I think you'll like your substitute teacher, said Mrs. Jewls. I spoke to him over the vacation. He seems like a very nice man. Oh, a man? Asked Damien. Cool. They all thought it was pretty neat to have a man teacher. Yes, said Mrs. Jewls. His name is Mr. Gorf. What kind of name is Mr. Gorf? We're going to stay tuned to find all about Mr. Gorf. Bye, my sweets.